Welcome to The Culture We Speak. I'm your host, Deanna Latimer-Hearn, and for this episode, I connected with Dr. Vishnu Nair to discuss capitalism in the field of communication sciences and disorders.
From the flavorful foods we eat to the rhythm of the beats we keep, our hair and clothes define what it means to be chic. For centuries, onlookers have been captivated by our mystique and every aspect of our being that makes us unique. This is The Culture We Speak.
Dr. Vishnu Nair is an assistant professor in the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at University of Reading, or UOR. He is trained as a speech-language therapist and has worked in universities across 4 different countries: India, Australia, USA, and the UK. He co-leads the health theme of the Center of Literacy and Multilingualism at UOR. His current research utilizes critical methodologies in understanding the intersection between bilingualism, race, and disability. He is committed towards decentring English and monoglossic ideologies and emphasizes on engaging in research and clinical practice that is rooted in racial, linguistic, and disability justice. Thank you for being here and welcome to The Culture We Speak.
Thank you, Deanna, for having me.
I want to start with a question about just your experience in different countries. I am an avid traveler. I know you just came back from vacation, but since you've worked in different countries, I would love to know, what is your perspective on the practice in the profession across those different countries? Have you seen troubling patterns or anything of that nature in working in those different settings?
Yeah, so I started my profession, my education was mainly in India. So it took me a while to understand that a lot of what I learned in India probably would be a mix of the American curriculum and the British. So it's kind of like, kind of an amalgamation of that. And I think the profession evolves, right, from in those countries. So I think those probably more American standards could be, kind of like influence. Depends on how the curriculum is being evolved as well. In Australia, I did not practice as a speech and language therapist, although I have been kind of, privy to a lot of practice that my colleagues were doing. But I did work in a speech and language therapy department. So in my initial part of the career, I was mostly in a research environment. So I was completing my PhD. So I was a bit divorced from the speech and language therapy world then. In the US and in the UK, I can say that I'm much more kind of aligned with what's going on in the profession. I would say there are similarities probably in terms of our basic profession is setup, what we do, etc. is pretty much the same everywhere in all 4 countries. What I did experience, though, is in the similarity, it's kind of like upsetting for me to say that, is one of the kind of crucial and upsetting similarities that the profession is taught in a way that is totally uncritical in all 4 countries. So it's pretty much like you are given the information, and it's a medicalized field, medicalized as opposed to a medical field. So it's very much medicalized. And then you take the information, you kind of like grasp it, you take the exams, you graduate, and then you go out in the workforce and you practice. And that's the troubling pattern. That to me, apart from all the other, other isms that we know that are troubling, racism, all of that. Because the issue of uncriticality is really, really important because it's related to everything that we see in the profession.
Yes.
In terms of how communication is conceptualized, very much from a very Eurocentric standpoint, very European ways of, conceptualizing communication. And that relates to how the origins of the profession, and then how the profession is propagated and spread in all over Europe and to the US and to the global South after World War II, right? So it's kind of like very Eurocentric in that way, even in India. I actually would say in India, even it's much more, the curriculum is much more colonized and Eurocentric, and the imposition of standard ideologies there, it's much more there. So that issue of uncriticality, which doesn't really look at the origin of the profession, which doesn't problematize the Eurocentric ideologies ingrained in the profession. So when we talk about racism, when we talk about linguistic justice, we talk about linguistic discrimination, we talk about everything that we talk about to achieve justice, suddenly there's a reaction because there's a history of 60 or 70 years of profession not looking at the way in which the pedagogy, the curriculum, and our practice is being kind of like not critiqued, and suddenly when there is a sudden criticality, people are resistant to that because they think it's ideological. So I would say the lack of critical reflection and lack of criticality give rise to all the problems that we see in the profession, and that's what troubles me.
I think about it as well. When we look at, like you said, the global south and how we see a lot of situations where people are planting programs that sort of support this idea of speech language pathology, we see a lot of the perpetuation of this Eurocentric ideology that says, well, this is the way it has to be. One, this is the way it has to be taught. This is the way it has to be learned. And this is the way it has to be practiced, which then erases even the cultures that are then adopting these practices. And so that is a big issue for me, especially in the work I do, which overlaps significantly with what you do. I feel like it creates a lot of violence towards communities that are adopting something that they feel is going to be beneficial, but then it essentially also is perpetuating harm against themselves.
Correct. And I think you raised such an important point, which, we were looking at a project on sustainability and people were talking about capacity building. And then I always wondered, when people go and set up these programs elsewhere in the global south, mostly in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Nepal, in places, Nepal is in South Asia, but, basically in Asia and Africa. To me, that is an extension of a colonial project, right? It's the
exactly.
way in which, it's an extension of a but people just don't realize it. And I actually think, do you even understand the societal structures of those places? Do you even understand the community? Do you even understand anything? So, and how can you just uncritically implement and go and set up a program there and call it, oh wow, we are actually building capacity, and then kudos to us, So to me, and that itself is kind of like how imbalanced the power structures, it's a very practical example of how manifestation of how the power imbalance between the global south and the global north. And that's a program is a good example of how we should critically look at our profession.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sitting here just nodding at everything you're saying. I'm one question in and I'm like, yes, all of this. So all of this is what I wanted to talk to you about, on this platform, because I wanted to really amplify your voice and amplify your perspective, because you've seen so much and you've been in all these different settings, and you clearly have, you've built a platform where you can actually address these issues and be critical of the profession. What you're saying sort of resonates with me because of the fact that I see a lot of the same attitudes in critical examination of the United States. It has kind of gone on for so long that we accept these different practices and racism and issues and all the different isms and phobias, that when you address that, when you call it into question or you say this isn't okay, it becomes an attack on the United States itself, rather than on this institution of racism and anti-Black and anti-everything else. People take it as an offense against the nation. And it's so ingrained in the nation that that's what happens. And I feel like when we do the same thing with the practice of speech pathology, communication sciences and disorders, people have that same vitriolic response to it because of the fact that it's so ingrained in the programs that we're in, and it's so ingrained in the practices we do, that it's hard to tease them apart. And so when we become critical of the things that are harmful and that are violent towards minoritized groups, then it then becomes an offense to people who have, dedicated their lives to this study.
Correct.
And that can be problematic. But I do want to make sure we're centering the most marginalized, the most impacted, because obviously in the global south, we have people who are being erased by these programs. In one of my podcast episodes, I talked to a professor who engaged in some work where she went to live in Malawi and did some work there. I'll say she has guarded perspectives on the idea of sort of this voluntarism movement. And I see a lot more voluntarism now. But like you said, when you move into a place or you go to a new culture, you really have to be a student of that place. You can't just walk into there and say, these are the things you need to be doing.
Correct. Yeah. I just want to respond to that earlier point that you are, or the current point that you're mentioning about. I'm not against people going and setting up programs, but you cannot just go there and set up programs as a savior, because if you're genuinely interested in the culture, then what you need to do is you need to collaborate with people who are from that culture, from that country, from that local community, and let them be the driving force of setting up something, understanding, the social structures, understanding disability, all of that should come from the local people. And you take a back seat and provide resources like financial resources.
Yes.
That should be the way. That should be the way. But that's not how it is done right now. It's a bunch of white researchers who go there. They set up programs in Cambodia and Malawi or wherever, and then you will see capacity building, and then you see 5 articles published next day, right? So that's what we're critiquing. That when we think about capacity building, we need to think about the many folds of different ways in which colonialism takes place and performs its duties and actions, and how it is kind of like swept into our profession is what I'm talking about. And the other point that you raised, that if you critique institutional racism, it becomes a critique of the US. It becomes a critique of the UK and in India too, that we see. Anytime you critique caste, anytime we critique the majority, it becomes a critique of the nation itself. So that kind of dangerous fusion that identifies the majority culture with the nation, which is the fusing of the majority culture with the nation, is very dangerous. And that's how it gets enacted in our profession, especially in our profession. Language becomes a proxy for race, and so much of your work is around respect the dialect, right? So the standard quote unquote the white American English, which is the majority English, becomes the nation's language, therefore. And that's why, so that dangerous fusion is what we're trying to separate and say that there are many languages within one nation. There are many nations within one nation, and that's the idea of a pluralistic society, which when you try to impose that kind of majority culture, it has repercussions on people who speak other type of languages. And obviously it has repercussions in terms of violence and all other kinds of things that we see in the US in terms of January 6th or whatever. But even at a day-to-day, from a linguistic point of view, it has real violence towards people of color.
Yeah. And I want to speak for a moment on this idea of language as a proxy for race that I see a lot of, especially as I do work in African American English. In the United States, we have laws that protect against discrimination of all different types. You can't discriminate for race or gender or all sorts of different aspects of a person's identity, but language is not protected. And language serves as a backdoor to then perpetuate all of those other isms and phobias that we say are against the law, because all those different aspects of our identities are encoded in the way we communicate. And so I can pick up on that based on interviews or interactions I've had with people. And then I can use that as my backdoor to say, well, I don't think this candidate's a good fit. And I think that's what language has sort of become. And in a lot of ways, I see the work that we're doing as speech pathologists, as we call them here in the US, I see us really being more so policers of language and policers of culture, because we're going out and we're enforcing those who, quote unquote, fall outside of this Eurocentric model of culture and language.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I would also add, when I say accent, it's kind of covered in language, but it is accent because in our field, we separate it from the way we look at language, right? And more so in the United States. So it's not enough to include language, in my opinion. It's also enough to, we need to think about accent in the way it is conceptualized. Yeah.
I think so. I think that's a major point. Thank you so much for your insight on these things. This is awesome. So I want to shift to the article that you, Farah, and Cushing recently published. And that article critically examines standardized testing in speech pathology. Can you talk a little bit more about the race, disability, and capitalism and the relationship between those? And I'm laughing because this is kind of how we connected. I saw this article and I was like, yes, like all of it. Like, so sometimes you read things, and obviously we're critical readers and critical, researchers and all of that. But I was like, I just want to say yes, like all of this is accurate. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship between race, disability, and capitalism?
Yeah, no, I was laughing because that's such a broad, topic. We could just sit here all day and talk about it, right? Well, I think that article came because of, I have been thinking about standardization in a way that I thought, why is that our profession kind of do this kind of emphasis on standardized testing? I never made sense of it, because to me, um, it cannot just be that we just want to label something, we just want to label a disorder, and then it's simply not the
Mm-hmm.
case, right? So there has to be kind of like multiple intersections of economic interest ingrained in that.
Yeah.
And where did that even come from? And obviously, the article was published. A group of colleagues were, coming up with a special issue, and we were invited to contribute. And I decided to write about standardization, primarily because I was quite tired of seeing, because I am a bilingualism researcher primarily. I was quite tired of seeing, even in bilingualism research, how much of this standard language ideology is being imposed, and how bilingualism is being distorted. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's the word, and I
Yeah.
would say infested with really standard language ideologies.
Yeah.
And I was really disappointed by the state of affairs in the profession. But then it became an article that critiques standardized testing. So it became bigger than bilingualism, or it became bigger than that, because then obviously, when you think about standardization, you cannot think about standardization without thinking race,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and disability.
Yes.
And the other aspect of it is capitalism, which we
Mm-hmm.
often forget, that how this is kind of ingrained in that. Now, combining all these three aspects was one major, I'm just going to, for the lack of better word, I'm going to say, well, one hell of a task.
Yeah,
To,
I'm sure.
yeah. So I was lucky enough to collaborate with Wada, who is a dear friend of mine, who is a practitioner in London, who has been talking about issues of race and standard language ideologies in the profession, and Ian Cushin, who's a friend and another colleague from education, has been talking about standard language ideologies in the field of education.
Mm-hmm.
So the one of the things that I started thinking about standardization is that I know that anytime there is fluidity in language, so what I mean by that is that if you look at our society, if you look at where languages work, how people behave around
Mm-hmm.
us, right? There is such fluidity. There's such diversity in the way
Mm-hmm.
people communicate. Now, even if you say, okay, I speak standard American English. Now, let's accept the fact that there is something called standard American English. Even there is such incredible diversity in that, what we call the quote unquote standard American English.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I identify as somebody who grew up speaking or listened to or exposed to Indian English, and even there's such an incredible variety in Indian English. And even if you think about English, there are world Englishes, So although,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so there is so much diversity in the way we think about language. Now, when you think about standardization, simply speaking, it's just the exact opposite of diversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to quote my favorite author, Arundhati Roy, here, and she talked about standardization or nationalism a while ago. It's you really have to look at where did this idea of standardization originate, and then you will see the origin of this is pretty much in the European nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
where the same majoritarian politicians or people wanted to have one nation, one language, and one
Mm-hmm.
culture and one people. And that's where these ideas come from, right? So you see the rise of Nazism and fascism and all of that.
Yep.
And you can really draw a straight line to standardization there. And
Mm-hmm.
language is often kind of considered to be the binding factor that kind of like unites this one language, unites one nation, right? So that,
Mm-hmm.
that ideology is so therefore, anytime you create a standardized test material, you cannot deny the fact that the foundational logic comes from that. You might think you may not even relate anything with fascism and
Mm-hmm.
Nazism, but you can't deny the fact that
Yeah.
the foundational logic comes from that,
Yes,
right?
it does.
So and that has not been even discussed. And then when you really think about this foundational logic, this logic was used to colonize people all around the world, saying that
Mm-hmm.
your bodies and your languages are uncivilized.
Yes.
So that you will see right from the colonization of Africa. You can see the early colonizers' reports, notes. In case of India, I can say that Macaulay, who introduced English education, wanted to civilize us because our languages were very much inferior to English.
Mm-hmm.
So those ideologies are there, and then you create again. You come back to this European nationalism, and then you will see from that emerging the ideas of race ingrained very much in it. So you see standard language ideologies, a connection to nationalism, race.
Mm-hmm.
And then you really look at, disability because that's what we are in the business of, kind of like, looking at speech and language disability.
It's in our name, right?
Yes.
We're pathologizing people.
Exactly. And then you look at the creation of standards very much based on the ideal human being. And in this case, the ideal human being is a white European man, right? And an able-bodied man,
yes,
or an abled man. So you see that ideologies of ableism and then disabilities linked to that. So in other ways, that when you create these tests, then obviously universities subscribe to it, and these ideologies are ingrained in it. And then, clinicians buy it, universities buy it. So you will see a profit generation. So it simply put it, you see these layers of capitalism then ingrained in that. And these are massive corporations that we are talking about.
Billion-dollar corporations.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
The testing industry. If you read the article, you will know who we are talking about, right? It's there in the article. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's disappointing because we know that you can't divorce capitalism from racism. I love the article. I mean, I've said that, but I love the article because it really ties these things together and makes it very plain for us to see that these are the things that we're contending with. And this is why our practice goes the way it does. And this is why we're learning the things we are. This is why we exclude certain people from programs. This is, it's all right there in the article, in my opinion. It really highlights the underlying factor.
And I want to go back to this idea of fluidity. And I really think that, this is not just for the present, actually, even, thinking about future, that whenever we try to kind of see this complexity in the way people speak, which in a way that we don't understand, there's fluidity or diverse forms of languaging, that it's natural for someone to, it's probably may not be, I think it's, as someone who comes from India, to us, it's accepting that, multiple forms of diversity in languaging exist. It's just acceptance of that. But I think at that, like from a European sense, who are quite used to that homogeneity or ignoring the diversity, it was a way to make sense of them to put this into a standard form and then impose it on to other people, right? So that's why I just say that Arundhati Roy used to say that any kind of standardization requires a lot of neatness and cleanliness, I'm not saying cleanliness, I know it is a loaded word, but it requires order and structure, and it doesn't like anything that is messy or, complex and, so let the diversity be, that kind of a thing. And that's what a standardized testing is actually doing, that it creates a set of standards in language or cognition and say, okay, there is phonological skill or whatever you want to measure, vocabulary. It comes from what the researcher or whoever construct the test think should be the standard, and then measures it against, their standards and say, okay, I am deficient in certain aspects, because it doesn't have the capacity to capture the incredible complexity or understand how incredibly complex how my languaging is, right?
Yeah.
And that could be true for people who speak Black English, or people who speak another language, or people who are disabled. Even their languaging is incredibly complex and beautiful. Cannot see the complexity and beauty in it, and that's the unfortunate state. And I think the question for speech and language therapist is that I understand that your profession requires you to, because standardized testing is the bedrock of a lot of what we do. But how can we understand these issues in a much more complex and critical way, and how can we subvert the system?
Yeah, we have an over-reliance also in the United States on this quote-unquote evidence-based practice, which is good, but then is also bad because it erases many of these minoritized groups or these marginalized groups that we're discussing. Those who don't get to be included in the data are the ones that we're erasing from this quote unquote evidence-based practice. And when we kind of center this idea that evidence is king, we're going back to that reinforcing of standardization. And this is the way it's supposed to be. And this is the only way. And we really need the qualitative data in order to incorporate diverse voices and perspectives and lived experiences. But we're essentially, from what I see in the profession here, we uphold quantitative as much more valuable, much more legitimate than qualitative data.
Yeah, and I think what we need is qualitative, but also critical methods and understanding of what it is to be critical. And critical doesn't mean that we're just simply critiquing it, but it has its own tradition, and a lot of it is rooted in Black feminist thinking. So understanding where that research comes from and why has it, given prioritized in a way it has prioritized, because a lot of these what we call as evidence is frankly comes from what I just described as standardized testing. Like even when we look at external evidence, internal evidence, or family values, these are the three pillars of evidence-based practice, the way we study in speech and language therapy. And that external evidence comes purely from standardization. To be honest, is white researchers conceptualizing it and then kind of measuring how the other, the minoritized other should perform, right? And then obviously we don't actually perform based on that standards, and then we are sent for remediation, whatever we are sent for. So we have all kinds of issues of overrepresentation in the system, in our children. So that standardization is really, really linked to how evidence is constructed. And now to counter that, we need to consistently build what we call the qualitative research, but from a critical decolonial tradition. That's what we need.
Yes, definitely. And we talked a little bit about groups that go of white researchers who go into plant programs and then put out these papers and things like that. And that centers the white lens. This is all like that mainstream gaze that's looking at how other people are, the quote unquote other is using language. One of the things that I have issue with there, especially with the global South, is that what we're doing really is going in and then benefiting from this quote unquote savior work that we're doing.
Correct.
For this group, now I get 5 articles out of this and I can tell you how they over there are performing. And then we can show you how it's, how it deviates from whatever standard we've set.
Correct. And in a fancy way, I can say that is epistemological violence. It's kind of misinterpreted. So it's FIFO, fly in, fly out. So you go fly into a country and come back and then you publish. And it's kind of misinterpreting and castigating the other as deficient. And so therefore you're actually kind of epistemologically from a knowledge production or a creation perspective, you're misrepresenting, misinterpreting, everything that you know about that the other, the marginalized, and then you are actually castigating them as deficient, which is kind of like an extension of the violence that we see from colonial times. So it's a very neo-colonial way of looking at evidence. So that we have to, kind of really fight against and critique that. But the other thing that I'm also increasingly seeing is that because there is increased conversation around, diversity inclusion in speech and language therapy or pathology in the US, there is this kind of like, workaround of let us be culturally competent now. And that is completely uncritically implemented into the way as well. So into the profession. So that is something that this new emergence of researchers looking at culturally, responsive or competent services is pretty much implementing the white standard language ideology, unknowingly or knowingly, I don't know.
Yeah, and they double down. I mean, I've even called out Asha about this in my my social media, and they will literally double down on this like cultural competence idea. And I'm like, by definition, competence has an endpoint. Like it's the idea that I have arrived at adequately, I know enough to do this work. And I don't think any of us ever know enough about other cultures that we don't live and experience in our, in our own personal walk in life. So I can never stop learning about other cultures. I can never stop working to sustain other cultures rather than simply, I know enough so I can pathologize them effectively with, and I don't know if Asha has like a lot of like promotional materials that they've already invested in this cultural competence and therefore cannot change their language, because I'm like, what is it about this that you're so stuck to? Because that's a misnomer. It's way off and it's promoting a lot of negative outcomes for our profession.
That's the thing, right? Like, I mean, if you're economically invested in it, and then
Mm-hmm.
if you really can't ideologically, you're ideologically deficient,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, morally corrupt, then you will go with your economic interest as opposed to your moral kind of like obligations.
Yeah.
My problem with the cultural competence, I think it needs to be completely abolished, abandoned, because it's
Yes.
really, really such an outdated idea that
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, who wants to be competent? It's
Mm.
mostly 99% white researchers.
Yeah.
So by 99% white clinicians or white researchers who wants to be competent culturally in our field, we're acknowledging that by default, that is the standard in our field
Mm-hmm.
because they wants to go and study the other,
Mm.
the unknown, the marginalized,
Yeah.
and they're just doing a service to us.
They are. Yeah, because
They
they're
are.
being so kind by
Yeah, there's a
taking a
kind
moment to invest in my culture.
yes, and culture is therefore when they study. I mean, there is a cultural competence checklist or something that I used to
Mm-hmm.
download from Asha website. I don't know if they still have it, but I do have a
I'm
copy that
sure
I,
it's
I just
there.
show. Yeah, if you really look at it, it's actually looking at maybe certain aspects of I don't want to say culture, but let's say race, ethnicity, or language. But
Mm-hmm.
culture is in race, culture. I mean, it's
Yeah.
much more complex than that, right?
And it
And
evolves.
they evolve, and culture is dynamic and evolving every day, I would say, with the influence of
So
technology,
yeah.
with the interaction between movement between people. It's evolving every day. So how can you capture anything that is so it's like the standard language ideology. You need to capture it to understand it. So you want to treat it as something that is fossilized and stagnant, whereas
Mm-hmm.
culture is more dynamic and evolving.
Yeah.
And that's a very liberal perspective. Like on our outside, it's a very nice liberal perspective that
Mm-hmm.
they want to go and study. That's really nice. But
Mm-hmm.
that's when you need a critical eye there. Well,
Yeah.
hang on a minute, hang on a minute. Well, it's a nice liberal multicultural position to take. But what is actually happening here is that you treat culture of the other as homogeneous, stagnant, and fossilized. And
Yeah.
that
And it
needs to
gives you
be,
permission to check off that you did this.
and the
So
tick
you
the
did this
box.
good deed.
Yes.
Now you're
Yeah.
finished and you can carry on with
And
whatever
you
else
can,
you're
and
doing.
then you achieve the required competency. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
what a multicultural state, an organization, a professional organization needs from you. Because as long as you have the necessary training of 2 hours, tick the box, then
Mm-hmm.
move on. And that's performative diversity.
Yeah. And we look
Yeah.
good because we're saying this is what we believe in, but we're not
Yes.
actually invested in what we're saying we believe in.
Exactly. And I think and the sad bit is that individuals who are marginalized with disabilities are at the receiving end of all of this service delivery because of this inaction, because of absolute non-commitment towards equitable service delivery in the way culturally responsive or culturally sustaining way service delivery should be practiced, and there's no understanding of that in the way profession is practiced right now. So because of that, the clients are at the receiving end. I mean, the minoritized one.
Yeah.
And I always, I always, it kind of like fascinates me that how long did we fight for having mandatory courses on multiculturalism? I mean, we are
Yeah.
not near critical, but even to start from multiculturalism. And now I think Asha has a mandatory kind of 2 hour training or some kind of professional
Yeah.
level.
Over 3 years, I believe.
Yeah. And
Because 2 hours in 3 years will definitely tell you
yeah,
everything you need to know about the global majority populations.
correct. So if you ask me one, if you ask me one of the similarities of these 3 countries that I worked, 2
Mm-hmm.
settler colonial state, Australia and the US,
Mm-hmm.
and 1 former and current colonial state,
Mm-hmm.
the UK, I would say precisely this, that they're not
Yeah.
interested. They're not interested, and there are professional standards, so much of professional standards imposed on minoritized and bilingual SLTs that you have to meet for safeguarding the clients.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, these white researchers with like 3 words, of Spanish, they can go and serve. I mean, if they know 3 words, but then there are people who don't even know that, right? So they can go
Mm-hmm.
and actually practice, and it's really, really kind of like putting. I would actually say a lot of the times that I have personally seen how bad the service delivery has been.
And culturally off base. I mean, when you come in with whatever cultural experience, your lived experience, it does not apply to the lived experiences of the people in this other place.
Yeah.
I've lived in France for a while. I lived in Japan for a while, and the amount of cultural learning that it took and the work that it took just to kind of see how society works and what their practices are and how they differ from my own understanding of the world. It's a lot of work and it took a lot of time. And I can't say, oh, I'm competent now in either of those cultures. I can only say that I have an understanding that's deeper than maybe some others where I haven't lived or even visited. But I can't say now I could just go in and let them know what they need to do for any of their processes or any speech therapy or any of that. I can't do that.
Yeah, and that's where that evidence should actually work, because none of us are ever going to be competent in any of these, right? And that's where we need the family to be the authority of their own culture. Right?
Yeah, and instead, I see more like erasure of the parent role or the caregiver role and suggestions that they don't know what's best for their family. And clearly, they're the expert. They know everything they need to know about the family.
Yeah,
it's tiring. So now I'm like, now that we're like thoroughly frustrated with man. So I want to know, how do you help your students improve their service delivery and understanding of historically marginalized groups?
Yeah, I think something that is within my power as an educator is to educate, because I'm not a practicing clinician at the moment. I don't practice. I mean, I do give advice to families, but I don't practice. I do have my previous families that I have been in contact, and they still talk to me. They still talk about some of the children who are now grown up and in the universities, all of that. But I don't actively practice, but I keep in touch with them to, hear some of the challenges, which is quite useful also in your teaching and the way you think about, our service delivery. So I'm a researcher, I am an educator. So I can get frustrated with professional organizations, but something that is within my power is how can I impart this knowledge into the curriculum? And that can be a fight at times, because in the US, you have a little bit more freedom as an educator towards the curriculum.
We used to, but not in certain states and not in this current movement that we're having against anything we say.
Correct. Yeah. Good. You're reminding me of some of it. But I'm just saying, if you still live in New York or somewhere metropolitan, I think, or in you still have some hope, right? I mean, I think we all kind of still live in that hope that we can actually, universities are still the last place for us to kind of think about and dream about and make that change. I mean, I hope. So I feel there is that freedom there in the US a little bit more. In the UK, because the curriculum, the degrees are very much tightly controlled, and there's a tight, kind of checks and balances here. So it requires a little bit more effort here in terms of tweaking what you want to teach. So I did create a new module, on culturally sustaining and decolonization practices in speech and language therapy. And this is something that I really love, because it's something that I really created from scratch. I really put a lot of effort into creating the material. And I teach that now, and it's an offer. I only offer it as an option module, and it was not something that, it was not a top-down decision. It was my own decision to offer it as an option module, because I really wanted to experiment with it in the first few years, because I really wanted all the students who are interested come and join, and then slowly see how that transition is. I ran it for a year. An early version of this module was implemented at another university previously, but this is the module that has a lot more criticality, critical thinking, and critical theories and decolonial theories incorporated into it. And I can say that what I have experienced in the last year is something beautiful, that they're amazing in the classroom. They get it. Most of them, they get it. And they also understand, they come with their real life expectations, because they are learning these theories. They're learning the problem, we problematize standard language testing and, everything, that they understand that these are very ideologically and socially constructed. These are not, anything kind of like biologically determined reality. They understand that. But then they also have to get into the real world and perform there, because the real world is very much structured for someone who follows a standard way of working, right? I mean, they can function a little bit more. Now, if you're a bit of a, out of a box thinker or a rebel thinker, the real world is going to be quite harsh for you or on you. So a lot of my students have recognized the learning that has happened there and how powerful it has been. And as an educator, I could not be more proud, of them.
Mhm.
But at the same time, they've also said that it has been challenging. Now, one thing they're all trying to incorporate is that, yes, they are in a system. They have to do some kind of standardized testing, or they have to write the report in a certain way, etc., etc. But the space that they create for the children that they work with is a private space between them and the child
Mhm.
and the family, and that's where a lot of subversion can happen. Now in the UK it's a little bit tricky, because then the traditional way the way intervention is offered is very rare, because it's like the National Health Service that it's like a medical model, right? If you're lucky, you get monthly one therapy sessions, like you
Mhm.
get a pill every month,
Yeah.
so it's
Mhm.
like that. But even then, that the students have created that, and I have especially one student I've been in touch with recently, have been really encouraged to look at the way some of the service delivery is set up in the system, and try and implement some of the decolonial ways of how we decenter these ideas of clinician to more like a co-learner.
Mhm.
You learn about language from your client, than you impose your ideas and goals onto the family. So those things are happening. So I would say, as an educator, that is the dreaming space. That is where I
Mhm.
think change can happen. That's what I believe
Yeah.
in.
It's encouraging to see future clinicians learning to question the systems that are already at play. It's discouraging when I see that a lot of people are still stuck in the this is how it's always been done and this is how we'll do it because
Mm.
this is the right way. So yeah, I see moments and like pockets of like hope in the same way that you're talking about. But again, in the US right now, because there's such an assault on institutions of higher learning, there are limits to what people can and cannot teach about. And
Teach,
I say
yes.
this from my lovely state of Texas and also the state of
Yeah,
Florida that I follow also
yes.
with a lot of things. There are a lot of assaults going on there, and it's really an attempt to quash anything that questions this mainstream narrative and this mainstream practice of imposing and oppressing certain beliefs and practices on everyone else. And
Yeah,
that I believe is rooted in fear. I mean, I really
yeah.
believe it's rooted in fear of the increasing diversity in our country, the way in which we have paid attention to these things in the wake of a lot of the challenges we've had, the state sanctioned killing of George Floyd and things of that nature created a movement. And that movement has sparked a lot of fear in a lot of people here.
I think if I taught this material in Florida or Texas, obviously I will lose my tenure, and I will not be working there,
Yeah.
So that's
Mm-hmm.
so there is a real danger in that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think tenure was created initially for those
Mm-hmm.
purpose.
Yep.
That for those kind of to protect you against precisely what we are talking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Against that kind of fascist political. But also I think, yeah, I agree, there is a lot of fear among common people, and there is
Mm-hmm.
this increasing diversity. I think there is conversation of by 2050 the minoritized population is going to kind of like overtake the white. I mean, there is all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
statistics being thrown around, but I also know that the politicians know exactly what we are doing,
Oh yeah.
because yeah, so they are not operating from a fear based idea. They are actually exploiting that fear. But at the same time, I do think a lot of these politicians and these common people, this we see world over, the rise in nationalism, the rise in kind of extreme right wing politics, normalizing this extreme right wing politics, even in
Mm-hmm.
India, even in the UK, that you see in the US. We see it in all over Europe now, in Italy, places like that.
Mm-hmm.
We see the rise in this kind of extreme nationalist movement. There are lots of common ideological threats that we can actually link that back to the rise in economic inequality. But
Mm-hmm.
also, they all talk about a glorified past.
Yes.
They all talk about a golden past. And when we
Mm-hmm.
really think about it, was golden for who?
Yeah,
Who was it
exactly.
golden for? And that's when this a lot of these critical theories would talk about the history,
Yeah.
this history of slavery, the history of caste or history of race, and the history of conquering and colonialism. And that conversation is very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's very uncomfortable because from an American point of view, well, racism existed, slavery existed, that we just got away with it. Now we're all good.
Yeah.
That's how the narrative operates. And also, like an academic recently wrote, an academic at Cambridge, that the stemming of the field, like the medicine, the technology, and engineering fields, where you don't require the kind of critical thinking that we require in liberal arts, in humanities, and so these degrees are being cut out. These are the places where critical theories, decolonial theories are being talked about. They are the ones. And anytime now, my previous employer, West Virginia University, right now is having a big crisis. You may have read it, and I actually think about it. Who are the people who will rise against it? Is the professors in history, the students in history, liberal arts, humanities? The doctors and the engineers comes the last, right?
Yeah.
So and that is exactly what they want to eradicate. And
Yeah.
in Florida too, the colleges, the tenure has been kind of like, the board of governors and the tenured professors in liberal arts college is being attacked, right? I mean, and that's what the critical thinking, they want to eliminate that. Yeah.
And it's funny because you mentioned, I want to go back to where you were talking about these different perspectives on our historical realities, things that have happened, and the fact that we like to erase other perspectives that are, typically marginalized in our society. When I was moving to Japan, just a quick aside, I spoke with someone who was there who was supporting our family in our move. My husband was in the military, and we were planning. So we had a sponsor who would help us kind of get acclimated. And before we left, I asked about, safety and things of that nature. And she said, "Oh, it's wonderful. It's like the US in the 50s." And I'm like, I had a very different understanding of like what this is going to be like. I was thinking like, that's not wonderful. That's actually
That's
like a nightmare for me. Yeah. Like to me, I'm like, okay, so hoses and dogs, like, I don't know what it is that you think you're drawing for me. It's not a positive one. And that's how she responded to me. And when I got off the phone, I was like, yeah, I don't think we have the same, sort of perspective or baseline for this time frame she's talking about. We don't.
And that explains the lack of empathy and the ability to relate from the other person's perspective of what it was. I mean, it's kind of generalizing. If this was for me and it should have been for everybody. And that's exactly the point when people try and talk about institutionalized racism or historic inequalities. People are not going to believe in it because that is not in their experience. So if it is not in their experience, it's not right.
Yeah, it just didn't happen that way.
It doesn't happen, right? And that is something that I just don't understand. It's something
it's wild. I think it's wild because when we're in situations today, like let's say there's an accident or some event happens in the world, we recognize that the way we experience it in different parts of the world differ, right? We understand that if I wasn't the person in the accident, but I was the person watching the accident, I understand it differently. That we can totally process. But when we move it back and say, hey, this historical event, we all had different perspectives on that as well. No, that's not possible because I learned it this way in my classroom. This is what happened.
Yes.
So I want to know, when in your educational or professional journey did you realize that your culture or your language was different from the quote unquote mainstream?
Okay, that's a really good question. And people would think that realization happened after I moved to the West, but it isn't true. It happened back in India because, India being such a diverse place, every 7 kilometers, your culture is different, your dialect is different, and in some way, I mean, if you're in a border state, you have this amalgamation of multiple languages. So multilingualism tend to be really higher at border state, but every 7 kilometers, at least your dialect, your food, your cuisine, the dress, everything is different, right?
Wow.
And a lot of diversity. So when I first moved for my studies, now before that, actually, I knew that where I live, where I grew up, and then kind of like 45 kilometers closer to that, there was a community. And when I went to school, there were kids from that community who would come to the class and then they would speak a different Malayalam because I spoke Malayalam as my first language. And this is the language I spoke at home. So I did not understand the specific dialect that they were saying. And so when I went and asked my mother, and she said, they came as traders from the neighboring state many hundred years ago. So their language is mixed with Tamil, which is another South Indian language. And then it's kind of like formed fusion of like this hybrid variety of this Malayalam and Tamil and gave rise to that. And that was kind of fascinating because I was so interested in language. And I was really good at languages compared to, let's say, math or anything. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, so that was the first time I realized that, like, even you could be living in a place where then you could have all these differences and you could be different still, right? I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
could be could be considered as the same people, but it could be still be different. Well, I did not have all that theoretical understanding at that point because I was too young to understand anything. But that was the first time, I would say. And then when I moved out of home, and then I went to for my bachelor's. There it was completely different experience because there were like 7 languages spoken in that city, and I had to take one of those languages as part of my degree first year, and then you just have to learn from the scratch from the alphabet. So that was another
Wow.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I also saw that kind of experience in terms of the way in which how the standard English ideology works,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how people who could not speak English, and then as opposed to people who spoke urban English, uh,
Mm-hmm.
had that differences, and it was quite interesting to think about now. If I look back and in the hindsight, like think about those experiences and India being so colonized, like if you know English, you're so far ahead in that competitive environment, right? And who are these people who could speak English? It's the urban upper caste people of
Mm-hmm.
resources, and I kind of and I'm privileged in that way too, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
do deconstruct my privilege. So now I am kind of like very much aware of that privilege and the resources I had, and that my family could send me for all these, like educational experience, or all the amazing experiences I had. It's because my family could afford a lot of those educational
Yeah.
opportunities for me, as much as I worked hard. So I don't believe in this kind of like this meritocracy kind of debate that goes in
Mm-hmm.
the United States. I can see firsthand in India the institutionalized casteism and how
Mm-hmm.
that is kind of devaluing the knowledge of people who are outside the system and who do not provide them with opportunities. So there is that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think from a massive kind of like difference, that I felt othered was obviously the point when I landed in Australia for the first time, and then you see everything is different. But
Mm-hmm.
then you're also suddenly in a program where you're surrounded by very much Eurocentric ways of conceptualizing and training, research training. So it was at that point, I think, beginning of my PhD, I would say that it was as much as I mean, it was a wonderful experience. I had very, really good supervisors. But I think as any people of color can relate, getting that training, from in a white institution, how that
Mm-hmm.
would feel like, how
Yeah.
that is. So I think although I had all these experiences back home, it was still my country. But then
Mm-hmm.
the moment I landed in Australia and went to another higher education institute, and this being a settler colonial country, having very much tight Eurocentric standards, that experience, I think it was something that I had to look back and then deconstruct and decipher. So I think I
Yeah.
would say at the beginning of my PhD, and then and it continued later on.
Of course. Yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
that it stops at any point. And you get lots of
yeah,
reminders throughout life with this. And I like that you talked about, investigating your own privilege. And I think
yeah,
that's part of the issue I have also with this notion of cultural competence is it doesn't necessarily turn the lens on the self. And if we're
correct,
not looking at our own intersectional advantages and disadvantages, then we're really
correct.
failing to serve anybody. And in a similar way, when I moved overseas for the first time, I saw so many privileges that I just had, there was no way for me to even understand that I was privileged in these ways. When I
Yeah,
arrived and was like, I wanted certain things, I tried to order, I wanted some shoes. And I was like, I don't like these colors. Can you get them in these other colors? And they were looking at me like, why would we order them specifically for you? Why would you get a special color? And they're like, no, this is the color that's available. And I'm like, no, I like this, but I really would like it if this part was red and that part was, and they're like, they're just looking at me and I'm kind of like, am I saying the words wrong in French? Am I speaking incorrectly? And it's like, no, you are way off base with what you're saying,
It's like an
and
entitled American.
yeah. And I didn't realize how privileged, how much I can get things made exactly how I want them, how everything is made to order the way I like it.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and that expectation to me was like, this is normal everywhere until
Correct.
I landed there and was like, okay, so I'm doing the wrong thing. I clearly am off base.
I would also highlight that passport inequities there, because like the fact that you're able to free movement that you are afforded to. It's
Exactly.
not someone that has a passport from Iran or even India, for example, can actually move that freely, right?
And some African nations as well.
Exactly, right. I mean, I think that is something that people forget, and sometimes in early part, like this I experienced while, especially during my PhD, while going for conferences, and I mean, I had to apply for visa for most of the countries, and where my European friends could just go, travel.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't understand. They just send me these things and plan things and invite me, and they say, "Well, let's see there in 2 days." I'm like, "No, I can't get there in 2 days." Like,
yeah,
it's
not reality.
It's not the reality, right? So I think it's important, for people to recognize that if you are an immigrant, yes, you had certain advantages and resources that allowed you to have that, to immigrate to the country, because if you did not have resources, obviously you couldn't afford that. But then once you land there, there is massive inequities in multiple forms, in terms of applying for grants, in terms of visas, in terms of passports. Like I know friends who could not visit their families during the pandemic, or and even after the pandemic, right? Because of these inequities. So they are the ones it's hard to grapple with. A lot of these,
it definitely is. I definitely experienced privilege in the sense of when they identified where I was from. A lot of people assumed I was from Africa. The treatment was completely different than when they assumed I was from the U.S. Service changed like instantaneously when they recognize, oh, you're from the US. Now I will work with you and I'll help you and I'll do all the, so a lot of those things, if you don't have an ability to look at yourself and where you meet with advantages and where you can also support others in those advantages, then you're not going to be competent in the work you're doing. And I use that term facetiously because I don't believe in being competent in terms of culture. I don't think you can fully support people who are from other groups if you don't have that moment where you look at yourself and that ongoing process of studying how you fit into the world too.
And I think that reflexivity, and from a critical perspective, that hyper reflexivity is part of that. That you critique your own research or your own ways of seeing the world, which obviously the other forms of evidence that in a quantitative way that you don't look at it that way. So that research or reflexivity, well, you might write limitations, but you will end your reflexivity there. It's not that you're actually talking about your identity and deconstructing it, right?
Yeah. So last question for you. How did you learn to embrace and celebrate those differences during your journey?
It's funny that you asked me, you had that as a last question. I don't know if I celebrate, in the sense that in the traditional sense of celebration. Recently, one of my closest friends' partner told her, because she was saying, Vishnu is kind of like, it's 95% white women in the field, and they need more gender diversity, which I make fun of. It's pretty much like they don't want lots of gay men in the field. They just need more heterosexual white men, Anyway, this particular friend was talking about, he's brown. So it's kind of an unlikely thing for the field. He's a male, and then obviously that is, and then I'm an immigrant and I'm gay. So he said, oh, he's a unicorn. He's a true unicorn. And that's when I really started thinking about my identities in that way, and because I know about all these identities, and I know for a long time I kind of grappled with it, because when I go back to India, I also have certain sense of cultural kind of like, adjustment and all of that. Like you live,
Of
and then
course.
you're never here, you're never, you don't belong here fully. So
Hmm.
you are like in this fluid state,
In
completely
between.
in a between space of liminal space, right? And which is okay, which is a beautiful space to
Hmm.
celebrate and
Hmm.
embrace. And I think that is what I started, because if you are in that hybrid fluid state, you're constantly kind of discovering something about yourself through other people sometimes too. So initially it was quite, I did want to change certain parts of me, in the
Hmm.
beginning when I did not know that. I think we all go through that phase.
Yeah.
But then now I'm very comfortable in who I am, and I'm grateful for all these identities and the intersectional understanding that it has afforded me. If I had not grown up where I had grown up, I would not have the other knowledge. If I was not, my sexuality is
Hmm.
different, I would not have the standpoint knowledge. I would not
Exactly.
have, yeah. So all of that knowledge I'm incredibly grateful for, because that truly informs my work and that truly informs my world knowledge at this point.
And your
So
contribution
that's,
to the field.
yeah. So
Hmm.
so that is what I really think. I honestly want, minoritized scholars and clinicians. I think we need to find ways and communities that celebrates us.
Hmm.
Because there are no outlets specifically going to reach out for, like, reaching out and celebrate. We need to create those opportunities. Recently I was just looking at Asha's some kind of LGBTQ awareness month or something, and I was
Hmm.
looking at who is creating all these posts, and then even there, it's all white gay men being
Yeah.
represented.
Yeah.
I hardly saw, there were like
No.
maybe one white woman and or
Yeah.
two white women, but
You're not going to
hardly
see
saw any black,
representation.
brown, gay people there, or other minority groups. So I was wondering, why is that even in a supposedly inclusive space, which is,
Hmm.
why are we being excluded there, right?
Yeah.
And that raises a lot of questions. So I think we need to create that space for ourselves in celebrating. And the other thing I will say, that we need to trust our knowledge, because oftentimes that even from a cultural competent point of view, that
Hmm.
we are actually, a lot of the times, a lot of students who get enrolled or ask me questions are from minoritized backgrounds. They actually
Hmm.
reach out and say, "Hey, can we take this module, or can I? We have this question, and how do you address it?" So they
Yeah.
are the ones who are actually. And then when you actually give them the knowledge, it's mostly articles written from a bilingual standpoint by white researchers. So they're
Hmm.
subscribing to a knowledge that they need, but from a white. But then I started telling them now that that knowledge needs to be critiqued and celebrate your intersectional understanding when you deal with the
Exactly.
client,
Yeah.
because you bring more awareness from your body, from your standpoint understanding,
Hmm.
from your standpoint epistemology. So trust in that. So I
Yeah.
think that's what we need to think about, and creating that confidence and celebrating our knowledge and lived experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. When you go through educational programs that center whiteness in the way that these do, from my perspective, you either become a person who reinforces those notions and
Mm,
supports it and says everyone else needs to conform the way that I did or needs to assimilate how I did so that they can be
mm,
successful, or you
yeah.
kind of become this disruptor. I'm
Yeah.
wondering like which path did I pick? Okay, it's probably not a question, but you either become this person who supports it or who disrupts it and questions it, and we have to foster that. And so what you're saying about the way you're encouraging your students is very important, because it can be very easy to minimize those aspects of yourself because they don't speak to what that majority voice says about
Yes.
who you
Yes.
are and what you should be. And
Totally, totally, and that's what I did for many. I try. It was not a fitting in or anything. I
hmm
didn't have any problem fitting in. My struggle was to, and I was skeptical of all this knowledge I was consuming, but I didn't have a
hmm
vocabulary. I didn't have the
exactly.
theoretical understanding to put that into. I knew this was wrong, and I think when I discovered my community, I wanted to say, I mean,
hmm
community in the old way. It's not, I mean, it's like people that you relate to. And then you started reading, really, and you started reading authors. From
Yeah.
there, it's that theory that comes from flesh.
Yeah.
It's that real knowledge, and that's when you really related everything to. So I think it's really, really important. And unfortunately, because I know that I'm the only one who talks about that in my university, and also probably in the whole of the UK. There are very few people, right? And that's a lot of people reach out. So how many minoritized faculty can afford to speak like that?
Exactly.
And are there in the higher education or as a clinicians? And that's the question that we need to have.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I'm rogue out here, not working with anybody. Because I mean, it's a strategy as well. So it's like I get a lot of people asking, "When are you going to do this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm good with me, doing my own thing, because I would rather be able to have my voice and to, that's an important part of our identity as well, and an important part of our activism is like you have to have your voice, and if you don't have that, you don't have much else, So yeah, I'm with you 100%. Thank you for being here and taking time to do this.
No, thank you. Thanks to you for creating this platform. It's amazing to see minoritized voices, Black voices being amplified. And, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to kind of contribute to that platform. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to The Culture We Speak. We appreciate your support. If you enjoy our content, please hit that 5-star rating and don't forget to subscribe for more content and exciting updates.